Hello and welcome to another of my classic magazine reviews and another non-Spectrum video. This time we're looking at the Specky's main rival, the Commodore 64. And our magazine of choice for this episode is the main man, big dog, heavyweight champion of Commodore mags, Zzap 64. And we're going right back to the beginning, in April 1985 and issue 1. The cover, featuring the recognisable Cobra Mark III trading ship from Elite, follows Crash's lead with a large Oliver Frey artwork. It isn't his most exciting cover, but it does mark the period where covers of Zzap and also Crash started to move away from the more abstract gaming themes to being dedicated to one of the big games covered in the mag. It'd be interesting to know if publishers paid for the privilege of being a cover star. Callouts on the cover are the aforementioned Elite, which gets an exclusive interview, a massive 50 pages of reviews, a competition to win a disk drive, and a feature listing the all-time top 64 Commodore 64 games. We'll come to all that and more shortly, so let's head inside. From the contents, we can see that we can look forward to an interview with the 19-year-old coding savant Tony Crowther, where he talks about his beef with Jeff Minter and why he's switched companies twice in a year. There's a solution to Ultimate's Staff of Karnath, a feature on music making programs, big reviews for Elite, Bounty Bob Strikes Back, Shadowfire and Lords of Midnight, more competitions, and a chat with Jeff Minter. We also get a list of the reviewed games, with a legend showing those that were awarded a gold medal, a sizzler, or were called out for being the tackiest of releases. Of the 37 games reviewed in this issue, there are 3 tackies, 9 sizzlers, and 1 gold medal. No guesses for which one that is. A double-page advert then tells us about 2 brand new big-name games from Ocean, though if they're anything like the Spectrum versions, then only one's worth your attention. Hewson's Gribbly's Day Out is shown next. It's a C64 exclusive I've never played, but it does look interesting. The editorial pages are next, and introduce us to the team with interesting job titles like Moneybags, Slave Driver, Gentle Persuader, and Female Order. Clive Anderson welcomes us to Zzap issue 1, and after an obligatory sly dig at the Spectrum, he tells us that Zzap 64 is dedicated purely and simply to games, helping you decide which ones are worthy of your time and money. In the What You Will Find in Zzap box, we're told that ultra-detailed reviews, a unique rating system, tips, maps, cheats, news, gossip, national game high scores, competitions, and a regular Jeff Minter column are all to be expected. However, what you won't find are any type-ins, programming and interface articles, or smart-arsed reviews from journos using Zzap to try out their stand-up routine, rather than actually reviewing the games, and definitely no business software. Then, after being told that Zzap is the bastard love child of Mother Crash and Father PCW, Julian Jazz Rignall, Gary Penn, and software editor Bob Wade are introduced as the initial reviewers, and all 3 will review every game to avoid inaccurate scores due to a single person's quirky tastes. The ratings are then explained. All are out of 100 and cover obvious aspects like graphics and sound, but also hookability, a kind of cross between playability and addictiveness, lastability, presentation, which covers the packaging, the loading screen, layout options, and anything else regarding the feels. Originality, which they call out as a controversial one, but one that they're going to stick by. And finally, we have value for money, which to all intents and purposes is the overall rating, which takes into account all of the other scores. But it's not an average of the scores. They're a consensus or compromise reached by the 3 reviewers, which does cause a problem for my own score comparisons in these videos, but we'll get to that a bit later. We're told reviews will be heavily opinion based and there'll be lots of pictures to illustrate what's going on. The Angry Spot box out starts with a dig at ignorant, pompous business commentators writing of the collapse of the games industry, but then just evolves into a slagging of the BBC Micro, calling it a fussy la-di-da machine with a ridiculous price and only 2 or 3 decent games. It definitely looks like Zzap is going to take a much more in-your-face and combative approach than Crash, maybe reflecting that Commodore owners are a little more partisan than your average 80s gamer. Despite being the first issue, there is a letters page that's apparently all from genuine readers-to-be, but most seem to just be telling Zzap what not to cover, grifting for a job, or asking for some game hints. The first feature has Chris Anderson asking industry key players for their thoughts on the C64, such as Commodore, Gremlin and US Goldfolk, that there Tony Crowther again, and Taskset boss Andy Walker. After that little loving, we get an ad for Mr. Crowther's Blagger Goes to Hollywood. Now before we hit the reviews, I thought I would just explain the format of these videos. Whilst flicking through the magazine's fun, the games are the lifeblood, so in each episode I'll play and review 4 of the featured games and compare my scores with the Zzap review. The games are always chosen by virtue of being the first review in the issue, the highest and lowest scoring games, and the final review. However, in the very first issue, we've already hit a snag, where the first reviewed game is also the best reviewed. And rather than move to the next best or next first, where the same game appears in 2 categories, I'm simply going to add a dealer's choice, where I get to choose any game I like the look of from that issue of the magazine. We'll come to that choice soon, but to kick off this episode's reviews, we have a biggie, one of the most anticipated games for the Commodore 64 and a great way to launch Zzap. The first, the best, and the cover star of issue 1 is Firebird's conversion of the BBC mega hit Elite. We'll get to Zzap's scores in a bit, after I've had a chance to play the game, but it's fair to say that Zzap were fans, awarding the very first game in the very first issue with the very first Zzap 64 gold medal. A red box does warn us that the reviewed copy was not quite finished, but it just required polishing rather than any major changes. The only noticeable change being the text character set, which was to be updated with a more computery font. A screenshot explains the screen's layout, and the main text is dedicated to the story and gameplay mechanics, which I'm sure 40 years on most are now comfortable with. Bob Wade's cartoon head tells us that he played the game for 6 hours straight and had to be dragged away. We also get a yellow box that tells us about the mega-rich mega-brains behind the mega game, who did the Commodore 64 version whilst also studying for their final exams at Jesus College, Cambridge. On the review's 3rd page, we get a guide to fighting, as well as conversely, how to make a killing without getting killed, information on the various ship classes, and a yellow box calling out the differences between the C64 version and the BBC original. Whilst acknowledging that it does run slower, they point out that all the BBC's bugs have been fixed, and due to the 64's larger memory, additional exclusive missions have been included, though those are top secret, so they have no information to share on them. Finally, you're warned about the C64 exclusive trumbles. These cute furry creatures reproduce at an alarming rate, and could fill your cargo bay if you're not careful. You have been warned. But now, it's time for me to board the Cobra Mark III, and prove why I'll always be mostly harmless. Okay, let's jump in. You play as Commander Jameson. We've got 7 light years of fuel, 100 credits in cash, and a clean license, so let's grab ourselves some cargo and get on the road. Sky, space, whatever. Okay, well, we don't want any of that food and textiles rubbish, we want the good stuff, the under-the-counter stuff, such as a couple of tons of liquor and some narcotics. Right, that's all in the hold, so let's push off. Ah, there's that recognisable HUD. It's been about 35 years since I last played Elite, but it all looks familiar. Though the keys definitely aren't, which could complicate things. But first off, we need to check our star charts. Galactic Chart 1 gives us a good idea of just how big Elite is, but we don't have fuel for deep space exploration, so let's switch to the short range view. The circle shows us our fuel range, but we don't want to use it all up at once, so let's pick a fairly close one and head to Leasty, which is a poor industrial corporate state that's reasonably fabled for its zero-G cricket and Leastian evil juice. You can immediately see the Douglas Adams influences, and with a course set, we can now jump to hyperspace. So now we just need to find the planet Leasty. We can't land on the actual planet, but we can dock at the space station to do our trading and refuel. Ah, there it is, but that's a fair distance away. But so long as there are no other ships on our scanner, we can hyperjump to a safe distance. Or, if you're using an emulator like me, you can just turn on turbo mode and speed up the journey a little. And finally, the space station starts to come into view, which is unfortunately where my experience goes rapidly downhill. I was able to dock enough times back in the day to earn the money for a docking computer, but that skill has unfortunately been lost with the passing of time. And on each attempt, I simply ploughed into the wall and exploded. But of course there's more to do, even if I couldn't dock, so let's have a go at combat. Oh yeah, I'm pretty crap at that too. Having just roll left and right and up and down, it's really hard to get the hang of nowadays, when we're used to games using twin analog sticks. I did get a slightly better and managed to shoot down a few enemies, but I have to concede that whilst I was blown away when it was first released, and still am in terms of the technical achievement, it just hasn't aged as well as I would have liked. Some less twitchy controls and this would still be immensely playable, but spaceflight games have moved on massively, meaning that it's just too big a leap backwards for me to get to grips with Elite in the 21st century. So let's concede that I'm not going to get any deeper into the game, and rely on both this short reacquaintance and my 35-year-old views on the game when we get to the scores. If you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know full well that I like to make things as complicated as possible for myself. And as Zzap don't give a proper overall score, I'm going to score them in the same way as Zzap, but then normalise them by removing the top and bottom scores and then finding the average of the rest. So let's have a look through the scores for Elite and you can see what I mean. For presentation, Zzap scored 94%, calling out the marvellous booklets that they called informative, funny and convenient. And I agree that the booklets are great. The HUD and the detailed info screens are also well thought out too. I'll drop it to 92 though, simply because I don't think the key layout makes life easy for the player. For originality, Zzap gave a score of 87, saying that 3D shoot-em-ups and trader games are common. But I'd counter that nothing had the depth of Elite, so I'm upping that to 90%. For graphics, Zzap scored 91 for the wonderful vector graphics. I've rounded it down to 90, due to the severe flicker on the rotating ship on the title screen. Zzap go big on hookability at 95, saying that from your first flight you'll know this is a winner. But I know many who found Elite hard to get into, or too fiddly to persevere with, so I'm going to go 90. Sound is very sparse, and Zzap gave it 52%. Again, I'm rounding down to 50, as it's functional at best. Zzap's biggest score of 98% was for lastability, due to the 8 galaxies, 2,000 planets, endless trading possibilities, and tireless action. I think they're over-egging it a little bit, as it does become quite samey, so I doubt anybody's visiting all 2,000 planets, so I'm going 94. And at £14.99 it was a very expensive game, but with the lovely packaging and booklets, it was definitely a premium product. Zzap gave it a score of 95 for value for money, and I'm going 92. And when we total all that up, you can see that there's a 14 points difference, which works out at 2%. But if we normalise it by taking off both of our highest and lowest scores, and then working out the average of what's left, we get a final score of 92% from Zzap, and 91% from me. Continuing our journey through the mag, we find a competition to win one of 50 copies of Activision's Pathfinder, by making at least 40 words from the letters in the game's name. And that precedes a 2-page spread for the game's Zzap Sizzler review. Rock and Bolt is next, with the arcade puzzler getting a mediocre 61%. We then get 4 pages of news, starting with a story about Commodore's revisions to its cassette player, causing havoc with many fast loaders. We then hear about a mix-up with Quicksilver's Soft Aid charity compilation. Quicksilver boss Rod Cousins got verbal permission from your man Bob Geldof himself, but jumped the gun in getting the pack released without any formal written permissions. But with 30,000 cassettes sold in the first 2 weeks, I'm sure they quickly forgave him. Commodore presented Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher with their 1 million and 2 million machines that came off their UK production lines. The 2 machines were then donated to a school local to the Corby factory. I can't be the only one thinking that Commodore could have cut out the middleman, or woman in this case. There are two stories about Everyone's a Wally. First, news that the follow-up to Pyjamarama is due for a 64 release, and secondly, that the B-side of the game tape will include the similarly titled pop song by Mike Berry, Mr. Spooner from Are You Being Served?
Everyone's a Wally, a Charlie or a Bugler or a Bug. Everyone's a Wally, an Honor or a Nelly or a Nerd.
And we also get the revelation that attendees of the recent Let event in London had been duped by the folk at the Firebird stand. The version of Elite that was running on a Commodore 64 was not what they thought. It was actually being loaded from a BBC Micro using some fancy new cables. And finally, we hear that Commodore still have no plans to reduce the prices of the Commodore 64, despite having done so for the C16 and Plus 4. Boots, however, have taken matters into their own hands to sell the Commodore 64 for £150, and that's a massive £80 less than the recommended retail price. I do miss Boots as a major player in the technology market. A double advert for games from the Edge is notable for its hilarious dig at Jet Set Willy when it asks what makes Wet Set Jelly sound like a computer game. The answer? Brian Bloodaxe with Primary Imbalance. And in the following 40 years, we still don't know what the hell Primary Imbalance actually is. After another competition, this time to win a disk drive by sending in your own game-beating tips, it's back to the reviews, and the second of my featured games. As my dealer's choice, I've picked Taskset's political satire, Seaside Special. You play as Radium Rodney, and you've somehow stumbled onto a conspiracy that the Tory government have been taken over by an alien menace called the Politicians. I mean, it'd certainly explain a few things, wouldn't it? Your only way to stop them is to gather up radioactive seaweed from the polluted Rottaway beach and then head to Downing Street and chuck it in the faces of the cabinet. Even on the first level, you have your work cut out as you are constantly harassed by a mutant jellyfish, whilst also trying to avoid the polluted sea and a rather aggressive guard who patrols the beach with a rifle and is happy to take potshots whenever you cross his path. Your radiation level is shown in the bottom of the screen, and it increases every time you get your feet wet, so it's best to keep moving. You have to collect at least 10 seaweed before you can move off the beach at the bottom right and head to Downing Street. With a great interpretation of number 10, your task is simply to chuck the gathered seaweed at the windows whenever a politician appears. The interpretations of the Conservative Cabinet of the day are really excellent, and I can definitely spot Howe, Lawson and Tebbit. Each politician has to be hit 5 times to defeat them, so it'll usually take a few trips to the beach to collect enough seaweed. Second time round at the beach, and we now have more rocks blocking our path, and also an angry crab to contend with. You can collect more than 10 seaweed before heading to number 10, but if you lose a life, then you lose any that you've already collected, so you do have to balance the risk and reward. The colour of the politician's face tells you how many times they've been hit, and this is remembered across visits. And if you can manage to get rid of all the cabinet members, then you'll be able to have a go at Maggie herself. Who said dreams don't come true? A third visit to the beach brings even more enemies. This time, a giant seagull hovers above and swoops down to attack. I can see how limited the game is, with only 2 locations and very simple gameplay, but I've quite enjoyed Seaside Special. The jolly cartoon graphics and the satirical dystopia of Thatcher's Britain definitely hit my funny bone, and there's enough going on to keep me trying to do better each time. It definitely could have done with another location or 2. But if they'd only released it at a budget price, then I think it would have been quite fondly remembered. Ah, that wasn't very sportsmanlike, shooting me in the back. So now let's get those Zzap scores back and see how mine compare. Zzap liked the humorous instructions and gave presentation 72%. I'd also call out the use of writing in the sand that gets washed away by the sea for in-game info, so I'm giving it 75. For originality, Zzap said it's the same old gameplay, but that it's a great scenario, and gave it 78%. I've gone 80, as it truly is a unique premise, with its wacky political nonsense. And there can't be many games set on a beach. Shout them out in the comments if you can think of any that aren't beachhead. For graphics, Zzap have given 75%, saying that there are some excellent political caricatures, but that some of the sprites are indistinct. Once again, I'm upping that score. Even on the beach level, there's loads of character, so I've gone for 78. For hookability, we're in agreement at 70%. Even if the novelty wears off after a while, the game's a lot of fun early on. Sound gets 61 from Zzap, who quite rightly said that the tune will get annoying, but it's well done, and the effects are all reasonable enough, so I'm going 65. Lastability is our biggest disagreement, with Zzap saying that it's not too good once you've killed Maggie, and gave a score of 48, but I found that quite harsh, and have given it 60. Finally, at £6.90 for a game with only 2 locations, it's definitely pushing its luck. Zzap gave it 61% and said it's fun for a while, especially if you vote Labour, and I agree. They'll push the score up to a more reasonable 65. Zzap's total points for Seaside Special came to 465 over the 7 categories, whereas I was a little more generous with 493, a difference of 28 points, or 4%. When we normalise that to get an overall score, we see that Zzap scores are equivalent to a respectable 68%, whereas mine is 3% higher at 71. Turning just one page in the magazine and we find another of our featured games, but this time it's The Wooden Spoon. The worst reviewed game in issue 1 of Zzap, with a score of 27%, is Activision's Web Dimension, which they call a somewhat strange mix of puzzle, music and light that's intended as more of an executive time waster than a game in its own right. I'm always intrigued by these experience games, so let's give it a go. After that wonderful attract mode music, I'm really up for this. I've read the instructions, but I'm not fully sure I understand them, so let's just get stuck in. Before us is the web of life, from which an array of organisms spring. You must freeze each of the creatures with music by holding the fire button as the creature meets you, but don't touch the trail of light that they leave behind, as that's deadly. Though it does fade over time, so there's always a way through the web. Not that it would matter if there wasn't, as you're bestowed with both unlimited time and lives. Freezing all 5 of the organisms will trigger round 2. Here, simply meet all the on-screen sparks without crossing your own trail of light. Succeed, and you're treated to another of the game's 11 excellent themes, and a psychedelic light show. Navigating the web can initially be a little bit tricky due to the shape of some of the intersections, meaning it's easy to try and go right but find your character going up or down, for example. But you do quickly get the hang of it. The front cover of the game states that over 150 years ago, Charles Darwin developed his theory of evolution, so it's about time somebody made it hip. And the organisms on the web are designed to represent key stages of Darwin's theory, such as atoms, amoebas and plants. But other than their look, the game follows exactly the same path from then on, save for a bit of extra music. But music of this quality is actually a good reason to play on. You'll eventually tire of it as a game, but as a relaxation tool, I found it really impressive. I felt noticeably calmer after playing, which certainly isn't the case for many games. I think I may well have a significantly different opinion to Zzap regarding web dimension. So let's take a look at those scores. For presentation, Zzap have scored 75, saying that the title is presented as an entertainment rather than a game. I'm not sure how that explains the score, but for me, apart from the music, which we'll come to separately, there's very little in the way of in-game presentation, save for the attract mode, and the inlay is a little wacky to say the least, so I'm dropping that score to 70. Originality scored 64, saying that there were similarities to the game Amidar, and I suppose they're right, maybe Amidar crossed with Quicks, or Kicks if you prefer, but the whole executive entertainment thing feels fairly original, so I'll up it to 68. For graphics, they say there's an evil-looking web, but little else, and score 54. I do agree, and although I'm scoring a little higher at 58, I did notice something that I feel made the game look a little uglier. The light trail that's left behind by organisms colours in character blocks, and this no doubt makes collision detection much easier, but the graphical effect gives the impression of colour clash, which just didn't work for me. Hookability at 42 was due to the awkward controls and lack of addictiveness, and whilst I agree on the controls, I found the game quite addictive early on and played for a fairly long session, so I scored 65. Sound scored high at 81, saying that the tunes were terrific but became repetitive. Again I agree, but I still think they're worth 85. Lastability scored low due to the lack of variety and the pointlessness of it all, which I found existentially amusing given the philosophical nature of the game, and where Zzap gave just 32, I felt 52 was a more representative score. Value for money, however, was the worst score. For a game with only 2 samey levels, to cost more than even the most expensive traditional games really is taking liberties, and no matter how much I got out of it, £11 is a slap in the face. Zzap scored 27%, and I was only a little more generous with 40. Which all means that on pure scores alone, I gave Web Dimensions an additional 63 points, which equates to 9%. However, when normalised, we see Zzap's overall score is 52%, while mine is 63%, so a jump of 11%. Moving on with the mag, we find a review of Durell's real-time adventure Shades, which was slammed for being an arcade adventure with not enough arcade or adventure to be satisfying. Bounty Bob Strikes Back fares much better, and he's awarded a sizzler, as is US Gold's conversion of the Sega arcade hit Spy Hunter. Aqua Racer though is given a fair to middling score for being pole position on water. And Software Star, Kevin Tom's new game following his Behemoth Football Manager, fails to inspire. We then get a review for a game that was almost my dealer's choice, but only because of the odd name, Tim Loves Cricket. Firebird's £2.50 silver range is featured in a 2-page ad, before we get another sizzler review, this time for Helicopter Sim Super Huey. We then see Penetrator ripped for being yet another clone of the Aging Scramble. Pole Position gets the same aging criticism, but fares better in the review scores. And Airwolf then gets its controversial sizzler score. I haven't played the Commodore version, but if it's anything like the Specky, then there's probably a lot more frustration than fun involved. Another couple of reviews sees Platformer Dark Tower and Adventure Shooter Caverns of Silac sitting either side of the middle ground. And the last of the reviews in this section are for the average Jack Attack and the awful Buck Rogers. We then hear from Tony Crowther on life as a superstar programmer. We get insights such as his first game Mastermind being rejected by CMVG for their type-ins, and why he left Alligator. Spoiler, he just didn't like it. And despite some animosity between him and Jeff Minter, he'd love to write a game with him and split the profits 50-50. And for a games designer who famously doesn't like games, he lists a few that did keep him happy for a while, like Ghostbusters, Bugaboo, Staff of Karnath and Boulder Dash. We then get an advertorial for MiniOffice, which is a bit odd given the declaration of absolutely no business software at the start of the mag. And then we're back to the reviews, with icon-driven adventure Shadowfire scoring a sizzler and Paul McCartney movie licence Give My Regards to Broad Street faring a little worse. The adventure section includes 8 reviews, the best of which being Level 9's Emerald Isle, and the worst Eclipse Software's Ripper. In the adventure news, we hear about Mike Singleton's third game in the Lords of Midnight trilogy, as well as Gilsoft's The Illustrator, being launched to complement The Quill, their recently released adventure writing system. We also get the White Wizard's top 10 all-time favourites and hints and tips for Spider-Man, Urban Upstart and Twinkington Valley. Tirnar Nog then gets the review treatment, just missing out on a sizzler, as does Spectrum favourite Lords of Midnight, which has finally been released for the 64. The Great Zzap Challenge is the magazine's high score battle, with Julian Rignall victorious over his fellow reviewers at Impossible Mission from Epix. The inaugural challenge then lists the team's current high scores on 16 other games, some reviewed in this issue, and challenge readers to send in their own scores. The Zzap 64 Top 64 then lists the best 64 games released for the computer. I won't go through the list, but there are a few odd ones on there, such as Booty at 49. More interesting though is the list of top 10 tackiest top sellers. These are the games that didn't deserve to sell as well as they did, according to Zzap. The list includes a few games that may upset some, such as Daley Thompson's Decathlon, of which they said 64 owners should be ashamed of themselves for buying DT instead of their third best game on the 64, Decathlon by Activision. A launch subscription offer gets you 12 issues of Zzap posted to your home and any 2 of the listed games for just £14.50, which really was a bargain. The tips section gives advice on Impossible Mission, Zaxxon, Bruce Lee, Aztec Challenge, and also includes the second half of the Lords of Midnight map, the first half strangely being printed earlier in the mag with the review. More tips for Ghostbusters, Crazy Kong and Raid Over Moscow then lead into the very first detailed playing guide to Ultimate Staff of Karnath by school kids Lee Goldstone and Matthew Porter, the winners of the Ultimate Trophy for being the very first players to send in a solution. There's also a lovely map drawn by Ollie Frey from The Boys Information, and a final page of tips gives help on The Guardian, Raid on Bungling Bay and Pitfall 2. A 3-page spread on music making software then precedes another sizzler review, this time for Palace Software's Halloween 'em Up Cauldron. Frack and Battle of Normandy both get fairly favourable reviews, as does US Gold's Combat Leader, but Llamasoft's Mama Llama fares worse and is called disappointing, strange and hard to play with gaudy graphics. Ouch. 50 copies of the Broad Street game and a signed album can be won by answering 3 simple questions on Paul McCartney, before we get to hear from the yak himself, Jeff Minter, in the first of his regular column, where he has a go at verminous brats selling copied games to class members, distributors who are hype and profit oriented, and chain stores, before letting the Commodore buying readers know that his favourite game of the moment is the Star Wars clone 3D Starstrike on the Spectrum. Despite slagging off his new game, you can then win it, along with every other Llamasoft game, by answering 4 questions about hairy vegetarian animals. And then at last, we hit the final page of reviews. Master of the Lamps gets very average scores, apart from for its amazing soundtrack, and then we get our final featured game. The very last review, in issue 1 of Zzap, is US Gold's conversion of the little-known Sega arcade game Up and Down. Up and Down wasn't exactly easy to find in UK arcades of the 1980s, so many will not have been aware of it. But I do remember playing it in a small arcade in Stockport around 1988, so it's quite old by then, and I found it quite fun, so I was interested to try the home version. The Zzap team were split on this one though. Gary Penn hated it, saying that after playing this monotonous game for a while, it was the contents of his stomach that were up and down. Julian Rignall was a bit more complimentary, but it was Bob Wade who raved about it, saying that he thoroughly enjoyed this absorbing game. So let's see which of them was right. You are out racing your Baja bugger. No sniggering at the back. You must traverse the single width road, collecting coloured flags whilst avoiding other cars or going off-road. As the name of the game suggests, your car is a jumpy little bugger, and you can use that to your advantage by jumping on top of other vehicles to destroy them, or by jumping across gaps in the road. You can only really move in an upwards trajectory, but the track does eventually loop, so you can grab any flags that you missed. Technically, you can also go backwards, but as this leaves you vulnerable to cars coming off screen, it isn't advisable unless you've not had enough speed to get up a hill and you need another run up. The game mechanics and graphics do remind me of the Commodore version of Buggy Boy, taken off track and onto the road, but I don't suppose Bugger Boy would have been a wise name choice. Up and Down somehow straddles gentle fun and high frustration, which means it's unlikely to appeal to hardcore arcade junkies. But for a fun bouncing romp about a cartoon roadway, it's quite an enjoyable little game in short blasts, so I find it hard to see where Gary Penn's hate came from. But on the same token, I don't really get where Bob Wade's love comes from either. So I'm with Jazz on this one. Now let's have a look at those scores. Zzap gave presentation 73%, listing the 3 options available as joystick, keyboard and 1 or 2 players. But for me, the lack of any in-game presentation, like a graphical title screen or fancy high score table, drags it down, so I'm scoring 68. Originality only received 65% due to similarities with Coloursoft's Burning Rubber, and that might seem a little unfair as the arcade version of Up and Down looks like it probably came out first, but I will agree on 65. Graphics scored 61%, saying that the cars are great, but there's little detail in the backgrounds, and it's hard to argue with that statement, because whilst the graphics are a good interpretation of the coin-op, they are a little underwhelming, and I'm going to round it down to 60. For hookability, Zzap said that the easy control and fascinating task will hook you. I think they may be overstating it, but I will agree with their score of 70. For sound, the repetitive but enjoyable tune scored 60, and again, I have to agree. Lastability scored 74, saying it has plenty of variety and extra challenge at higher levels. But I'd argue that there isn't much variety at all in the samey levels, so I'm dropping that to 60. And finally, with a price of £9.95, Zzap felt that the game was well worth the upper price range and scored 71, but I'm not so sure, so I'm giving this 65. And when the totals are all totted up, we see a difference of 26 points between my own and Zzap's scores. And when normalised, our overall ratings come out as 68% for Zzap and 64% for me. And looking at the 4 review scores, despite some differences in the individual games, the average score for our sample comes out at just a 2% difference, which I think is a tick for Zzap. The final few pages of Zzap are mostly ads, but we do have yet another competition, this time to win Melbourne House's Penetrator and Dark Tower games, though both got terrible reviews in this mag, so you may not want to bother. We then have the Zzap mail order form, because of course the Newsfield Empire all started with the Crash mail order company. Next month's issue will apparently have details of a pole position-like game, but with 2-player split screen, an arcade adventure with over 1,000 locations, and some new sports sims. Not to mention the first Zzap 64 readers chart. And with that, the first issue of Zzap closes with a back page advert for one of the worst games ever to grace the machine, Elite's Dunlop tie-in 911 TS. So until next time, keep it retro, and if you want more Commodore coverage on my channel, then do let me know in the comments.